Order. Statement, the Secretary of State for International Trade. Secretary Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In October last year, my department published a white paper preparing for our future UK trade policy, in which we set out the government's commitment to the transparency and inclusiveness in our future trading arrangements. The paper also set out our intention to boost our trade relationships with old friends and new allies, expanding access to markets across the globe. Today, I can set out the role of Parliament, the devolved administrations, the public, business and civil society, and how the government intends to engage with these groups as we embark on our new international trade agreements to benefit the whole of the UK and ensure we meet our commitments to an inclusive and transparent trade policy. Mr. Speaker, scrutiny of our future trade arrangements is vitally important as we take powers back from the EU into UK law and begin negotiating our own new free trade agreements. I would like at this stage to make a distinction between our FTAs with new partners, to which this statement relates, and continuity trade agreements, those being legislated for in the trade bill tomorrow and to which the custom bill powers being debated today will also apply. With this distinction in mind, for our new FTAs, we will now put in place a structured approach to engagement to provide clarity on how stakeholders can feed into this vital work that will help shape the trading future of our country. To ensure that our new agreements and our future trade policy work for the whole of the UK, I believe it is vital that Parliament, the devolved administrations, local government, business, trade unions, civil society and the public from every part of the UK must have the opportunity to engage and contribute from the outset of the process. On Parliament specifically, Mr. Speaker, the Government is committed to providing Parliament with the ability to inform and scrutinise new trade agreements in a timely and appropriate manner, and I want to set out how this will be achieved. We will ensure that parliamentarians are given the opportunity to consider the level of ambition of the Government's approach to negotiations and the potential implications of any agreements. We will explore the best process to do this, but in this first instance, this could take, for example, the form of a general debate. In addition, the Government will keep both Houses updated on the process of negotiations through statements and updates to the International Trade Committee as the negotiations progress. This will include timely analysis at appropriate points to support decision-making. Of course, as in any negotiation, a certain level of confidentiality will be necessary to help ensure the best outcome for the UK, and these updates will be given with that in mind. At the end of a negotiation, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010 will continue to apply as it does to all treaties which are subject to ratification. Under CRAG, the Government will lay before Parliament any treaty it intends to ratify alongside an explanatory memorandum which will summarise the content of each trade agreement. And consistent with best practice with any new international trade partners, the Government will also, at the appropriate time, publish an impact assessment. In order to implement a new trade agreement with a new partner, the Government will bring forward a bespoke piece of primary legislation when required for each new future trade agreement that requires changes to legislation and where there are no existing powers. Parliament will therefore have the opportunity to scrutinise this new legislation in the normal way. Mr. Speaker, I believe that this process will strengthen Parliament's ability to shape and scrutinise the Government's ambitious trade policy agenda and our new free trade agreements with partners around the world. To develop and deliver a UK trade policy that benefits business, workers and consumers across the whole of the UK, we need to reflect the needs and individual circumstances of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We will work closely with the devolved administrations on an ongoing basis to deliver an approach that works for the whole of the UK. As part of this, we are conducting a series of collaborative policy roundtables with devolved administrations and key stakeholders in all parts of the country, which will draw on their knowledge and expertise, recognising their role in helping to deliver the objectives of our trade policy and future negotiations. We will ensure that the devolved administrations are able to inform the Government's approach to negotiations throughout the consultation period and, of course, with subsequent engagement throughout the entire negotiation process. We will also engage more widely in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, holding meetings with a wide range of stakeholder groups. And, Mr. Speaker, let us not forget the English regions, whose involvement in this process is also of vital importance, and who, from the North East to the South West, make a huge contribution to our trading performance. They too will be fully involved. As we prepare to begin negotiating future trade agreements once we leave the EU, we will also want groups and any individuals with an interest to have their say and inform our approach to negotiations. Our White Paper asked how the Government should seek views from the public, business, trade unions and civil society. We were grateful to receive thousands of responses. The responses made clear the need to move to a more formalised engagement structure so that stakeholders are clearer on when and how they can input into the process and how their information will be used. It's therefore important that we ensure that the public and wider stakeholders have access to this process online, to make sure that we reach the widest possible range of people, both in terms of diversity and geography. And I will write to all members with website and address details so that we can fully inform and involve our constituents. My department will also convene a strategic trade advisory group to bring expert external insight to trade policy making and advise ministers. We are inviting expressions of interest for membership and will appoint 14 members based on their technical expertise to take seats on this group. We will ensure that the group represents the varied interests of business, workers, consumers and NGOs in all parts of the UK. More details can be found on the dit.gov.uk pages. Mr. Speaker, I've said that all stakeholders and members of the public must be able to inform the Government's approach, and that is why we will launch public consultation for each potential new trade agreement. If we are to learn lessons from agreements such as TTIP, we need to ensure that people are able to express their views and feel that they have been taken into account. And I want people to feel invested in this process and that the benefits of free trade are shared across the length and breadth of the UK. This is also why the Government's consultations will last for 14 weeks, giving everyone the opportunity to share their objectives and any concerns about potential new agreements. And I will update the House on potential agreements that will be subject to consultation in the coming days. My ministerial colleagues and I will continue to meet with representatives from business and civil society, and my officials will continue to welcome technical policy discussions with a broad range of experts. We will also hold a range of outreach events to engage with stakeholders across the whole of the United Kingdom. Madam Deputy Speaker, the views gathered through the Government's consultation and engagement will ensure an informed and well-evidenced approach to each of our trade negotiations. I can confirm that before entering formal negotiations, we intend to publish an outline approach to each negotiation, setting out the high-level objectives and scope of that negotiation. This document, which will be published, will be accompanied by a scoping assessment at that point. As I've said many times, the decision to leave the European Union was not a decision to retreat from the world. In fact, we need to embrace it, to trade more, not less, fight protectionism and break down the barriers to trade wherever we find them. As agreed at the European Council meeting in March, the UK will be able to begin to negotiate new trade agreements from April 2019. It is therefore right that we set out how we intend to gather views from across the country now to inform the Government's approach to new trade negotiations before those talks begin, as they progress to conclusion. As we decide our own trade policy for the first time in over 40 years, I'm sure members of the House will agree that it's only right that we all get a say, and I'm confident that our proposals will deliver the scrutiny and transparency that the UK public, including Parliament, expect and deserve, and I commend this statement to the House.
Very good.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the right honourable gentleman for advance sight of his statement. I have to say, when he said that he wanted to boost his relationships with old friends and new allies, I did for a moment wonder whether he was talking about the previous Foreign Secretary and the current Prime Minister, but it seemed not. Mr. Speaker, the trade bill completed its committee stage more than 6 months ago. Since then, the government have been too scared to bring it back for fear of what their own backbenchers might do to it. But tomorrow, this House will debate report stage and third reading of the trade bill. So it was with a certain amount of disbelief, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I saw that today, of all days, the Secretary of State would be making a statement on delivering a transparent and inclusive trade policy. I thought to myself, this man's having a laugh. He is, Madam Deputy Speaker. For months, since the first publication of this flawed piece of legislation last October, we've been saying that it fails to do what the government led us to believe it would in the gracious address at the state opening of Parliament, namely to set out the legislative framework to deliver a transparent and inclusive UK trade policy. Business have been saying it. Unions have been saying it. Civil society has been saying it. Madam Deputy Speaker, did you ever hear of such a coalition? The ICC, the CBI, the BCC, the EEF, the IOD and the FSB all joined forces with the TUC, Unite the Union, the Trade Justice Movement and even the Consumers Association Which to tell the government they needed to sort this out. We tabled a series of amendments in committee. The government refused every one. So why? Why this protestation, this deathbed Damascene conversion by the Secretary of State? It is a welcome confession that in its current drafting the bill does not provide what so many on the government benches told us was the point of leaving the EU. It does not give control over our laws to this sovereign parliament. It gives controls to ministers. What today in his statement has the Secretary done to change this? The words are warm, the detail is far from clear. Will the Secretary of State be accepting new Clause 3 tomorrow, setting out a proper scrutiny procedure for trade agreements? We tabled that amendment in committee only to see it scorned. We welcome the Secretary of State's statement today that the government will be bringing forward a proper consultation process in advance of future trade agreements. Does this mean he will be accepting our Amendment 18 on consultation or new Clause 4 on respecting the rights of devolved administrations? The true penitent must not merely confess his sins, the true penitent must amend his ways. There's little in this statement that shows the government is prepared to do so. Madam Deputy Speaker, modern trade agreements are so complex and extensive that they reach into nearly all aspects of government and policy. But trade agreements are not like domestic legislation, which can be repealed when it is no longer technically suitable or politically acceptable. Instead, they place legally binding obligations on government in perpetuity that cannot be simply amended or repealed. And yet those obligations can be agreed behind closed doors, in total secrecy by government's negotiators alone. That is why it is incumbent upon members of this House to ensure a rigorous and robust scrutiny framework for trade agreements. Until now, the government rejected every single one of those amendments. It's welcome that the government, however late in the day, have tabled amendments addressing at least some issues before tomorrow's third reading, but they do not go far enough. They've now agreed with Labour that regulation should not be implemented on the negative resolution procedure. They've also agreed with Labour that there could be substantive variation in the rollover agreements as compared to the corresponding EU agreements, and have brought forward amendments that will require the government to report on any such change. But of course, as one hand gives, the other hand takes away, as they've also tabled an amendment that would allow them to ignore this, should they so choose. And reporting on a change is not the same as giving Parliament the power to amend it. I trust that given the Secretary of State's acknowledgement today of the bill's failings, he will be supporting those amendments that seek to rectify the shortcomings tomorrow. Finally, why are we having this statement today? It could and should have been delivered as part of the debate around the trade bill tomorrow. Indeed, any concessions should have been brought forward as amendments at any stage since the trade bill had its second reading in November last year. Today's statement can only have been brought forward in a bid to limit time for this afternoon's critical debate on the taxation cross-border trade bill, and to stave off any opportunity for honourable and right honourable members to expose the ludicrous position this government has now got itself into by saying it is going to accept ERG amendments that directly contradict the Chequers Agreement. There are a group of ministers and backbenchers both within and outside of the Cabinet who now appear to be deliberately steering the Brexit negotiations negotiations onto the rocks of a no deal, with all the damaging consequences for jobs and our economy of moving disruptively onto WTO rules. I believe the Secretary of State is one such. The warm words and platitudes of this statement do not mask the cynical political game he is playing, and they make a mockery of the role of this House in undertaking proper and rigorous debate on some of the most important legislation before us in 50 years.
The Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as there were no questions that were actually raised in that response, I'm tempted to simply sit down. One of the reasons that we give advance notice to the front bench opposite is so that may at least be talking about the same issue as we are. But I'm afraid that the Shadow Secretary of State doesn't seem to understand that the trade bill tomorrow specifically is not involved with future free trade agreements, merely continuity agreements. If he doesn't understand that point, I'm not sure what else he will understand of the bill. This statement today related to new free trade agreements. I gave this House a commitment that I would set out before the summer recess what our proposals would be in terms of transparency and inclusivity when it came to negotiating new free trade agreements. And the fact that we're giving statements during the negotiations, updates to the Trade Committee, show that we have done that in good faith. I'm afraid this afternoon we simply got bluster and bunkum instead of reason and rationality, and if anyone was making a mockery of anything, it was of front bench duties.
Order. For the sake of clarity, everyone can sit down. Sorry. For the sake of clarity, it will be obvious to the House that, as the statement makes clear, this is about how Parliament, the devolved administrations and the wider public will be engaged in the process of forming free trade agreements with new partners and scrutinising those trade agreements. In other words, this is a relatively narrow canvas on which colleagues can fix their questions. The Chair will not entertain long speeches about anything to do with Brexit, but I'm quite sure that honourable members will find a way of asking the questions they wish to ask while keeping within the narrow canvas that I've just made clear. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I rather share the opposition spokesman's suspicion that the only reason that this non-urgent statement is being given today is to reduce the already inadequate time that we're going to have to debate the highly important bill that follows, which is likely to be squeezed for 4 hours for speeches and divisions, although the opposition spokesman then filibustered, which I shall try to avoid contributing to. But as you've given your ruling, Madam Deputy Speaker, I won't give the full question I was going to ask about the rumours that the government is going to adopt this afternoon amendments which are directly inconsistent with the white paper of a week ago. Amendments tabled by my honourable friends. It's Amendment 12, and it contradicts paragraph 17A of page 17 of the white paper. Are any statements on the government on its trade policy in future to be relied on for more than a week or two at the moment? And isn't it rather premature for him to be coming here and explaining exactly how we may eventually be contemplating new trade agreements of our own, which will take many, many years to achieve?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I won't take up any more of the House's time. No, it's entirely untrue that that's the reason for the statement.
Stuart Hosey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and advance sight of it, and indeed the tone which he adopted today, particularly in relation to what he said about having Parliament scrutinise in a timely fashion future trade deals. What I would say, though, is make sure we have enough information to scrutinise them properly. Now, I'm not going to be as cynical as others, but I do find it slightly odd we're having an urgent statement on a 9-month-old document. But nevertheless, what was said was welcome, particularly in relation to liaison with businesses, with workers, with NGOs, particularly those concerned with trade justice. And I would ask that he confirms there will be sufficient sight and enough detail of future proposals for them to do their work as well. I also welcome what he said in terms of liaison with devolved institutions. But it's not enough simply to have liaison and discussion and consultation. If there are real implications, then consent may be required. A role in setting the negotiating mandate may be necessary. Actively seeking consent throughout the process to ratification would be something I would have thought the Secretary of State would welcome, and I hope he will look at our new clauses 20 to 24 tomorrow in that regard. But most importantly, I hope the Secretary of State takes on board, when he's liaising, and I'll take him at his word this is going to happen, takes on board the deep concern in society, in campaign groups, through all sorts of organisations about the implications of trade deals in the future for public safety, for food hygiene, for the environment, and understands that we do not ever again, and he referred to it in the statement, want to get into a position such as we were with TTIP, where after a short period of time there was mass opposition to something because it was a bad piece of treaty not discussed with the public at all in advance. Can I say one final thing to him? One final thing. He talks about future trade deals, and I understand why he's making that distinction. But if we have a trade deal which is being rolled over, but does require some tweaks or changes, which is subsequently extended beyond 5 years, that may look very similar to a new trade deal. And I hope he will look actively at having the same scrutiny and consultation with those arrangements as he does simply for deals in the future.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for raising a response with some substance. He's quite right that the length of time that's available is important. That's why we've chosen a consultation period of 14 weeks. The European Union, for example, has 12. Other countries have less than that. I think it's important that we allow that to happen. He's also right that in TTIP, many of the public felt that they had not been involved from the beginning of the process. There was no equivalent process to the one we're setting out today for the pre-negotiation phase, so that the public could set what they believed were their ambitions and their objectives for any trade agreement. All I would say on the issue of those future agreements is to look at what this House has already agreed on the CETA agreement. Chapter 23 and 24 specifically place restrictions on governments from watering down in any way either their labour laws or environmental laws for the promotion of trade. We've already agreed that that will be the basis for our future trade agreement with Canada. And all I would say to him is to judge the government on what it does, not what is said.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Deputy Speaker, it will be a brave man who doesn't acknowledge your strictures, and I shall stick faithfully to them, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend with the energy with which he's going around preparing the ground for these fiendishly complicated arrangements, and may I endorse very strongly what he said about the TTIP process and the absolute need for people to understand very clearly what is and what is not involved in these questions and these negotiations. And will he particularly do much more with our febrile and irresponsible press to convince them that these trade arrangements are not all about toxic chickens?
My old friend is quite right. It is important that we explain what is actually involved. It is also important to genuinely consult, as he says. That is why the government, in its pre-negotiation phase, is doing what's never been done to this extent before. Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO, said that we're leaving a period in trade which was about the protection of producers to what was about the precaution of consumers. I think our consumers are very much more interested in trade policy today than they've ever been, and I think therefore they will expect, and we have a duty to provide, the appropriate consultation for them.
Chris Leslie.
This statement is about consultations in advance of future trading arrangements. So can I ask the Secretary of State to assure the House that he at no time consulted with members of the ERG Conservative group about their 4 wrecking amendments, wrecking the Chequers arrangement, before they were tabled?
Madam Deputy Speaker, of all members in the House, I know what it's like to invoke your wrath, so I shall not stray into that particular territory about what may happen on legislation later today. All I can say is that the Government gave a commitment that before the recess it would come to the House with our proposals for consultation and scrutiny of new free trade agreements, and that's exactly what we have done.
John Redwood.
I strongly support the Government's line that where we have an existing trade agreement through the EU, we are entitled to take that over for us as they are for the residual EU. And I trust you'll just crack on with that and have it ready by March 2019 in case we leave then, whilst having a different process for a new trade deal, which I'm sure the public will welcome.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've always made clear, as I did at the beginning of this statement, that there's a distinction between the continuity agreements, which are covered in the trade bill that we will debate tomorrow, and new free trade agreements, which we promised we would set out the scrutiny procedure for, and that's what's happened today. I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it comes sometimes as a shock to the House when any government does exactly what it would say in the timescale allocated, but I'm afraid that's exactly what's happened today.
Tom Brake.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State said in his statement that he will ensure that parliamentarians are given the opportunity to consider the level of ambition of the government's approach to negotiations and the potential implications of any agreements. Can he confirm, therefore, that any such potential implications, say, of a US deal, might include chlorinated chicken, toxic or otherwise, hormone-fed beef or GMO food?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the whole point of the negotiation phase, which is one of 5 phases of an FTA, is so that the public can set out what they believe the level of ambition should be. And those who want to set restrictions on what they think the government's mandate should be in that negotiation will be free to express themselves during that period. That is exactly why we're setting that forward, because the worst thing would be to go into a negotiation where the public felt that their views had not been taken into account in any way. And there is as I said, this is not purely the the government being necessarily philanthropic in the trade space here. This is about our self-interest also, because it makes the job much easier for government and Parliament if the public feel they've been genuinely consulted. As my right honourable friend said, one of the problems with the TTIP process was that the public felt that they had been ignored and that negotiation had happened from start to finish away from public scrutiny. We have to try to avoid that in future if we are to take advantage of the freedom that potentially new free trade agreements will give the country.
Greg Hans.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on outlining the broad parameters of how future trade policy and consultation will work? I think he's in exactly the right lines, particularly with the commitment to primary legislation for each individual trade deal. But could he tell us a little bit more about the consultative round tables that he described? I think one of the things one will discover is that politicians and producer interests will very quickly try to get to the front of those. How will he ensure that consumers, consumer companies and consumer groups have their proper voice in that consultation?
Oh, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key elements will be the setting up of the Strategic Trade Advisory Group, and we will ensure that we have representatives across that, including SMEs, including consumer representatives, including development organisations and including NGOs. I go back to the point that I made earlier. It's absolutely essential that people feel that they have been genuinely consulted through the process, or all that will happen later on is that people will say that they do not accept the agreement because they had not had sufficient transparency throughout the process.
Chris Bryant.
I completely agree with the Secretary of State on 2 things. First of all, that protectionism is on the rise, which is bad for us in this country. And secondly, I'm delighted that he's sticking with the Constitutional Reform and Governments Act 2010 because I wrote those clauses. But can I just ask him a very specific question about future deals that we do with new countries? Will every single one of those include human rights clauses?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would refer the honourable gentleman to the answer I gave earlier, that the government should be judged on what it's doing. And in terms of the, for example, the agreements that we're looking at the present time that we'll be debating tomorrow, they all include those. I find it difficult to imagine that when we have a widespread consultation, that will not be a strong ask of the government.
Sir Desmond Swain.
But any scrutiny and consultation on manufacturers and food will be very limited to tariff and quota, because we'll be continued to be bound by the acquis, won't we?
And, Madam Deputy Speaker, without, since that wasn't entirely, I'm not sure, within the scope of the statement, I think that if you're looking at even pure goods issues, I think, for example, the ability of the United Kingdom to be able to abolish or reduce to zero tariffs on cars with the United States would have been something that President Trump would have welcomed last week.
David Linden.
Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. If Scotland is an equal part of the United Kingdom, why can't it have a seat at the negotiating table when they're negotiating the free trade agreements?
Well, Madam Speaker, back when we signed the MOU, we made it clear where there were specific areas where there might be specific interests of any of the devolveds, then that may allow us to have a seat at an international negotiation. Of course, it would be having to further the government's position on that. What we couldn't do would be to go into a negotiation where we had someone sitting with a seat on the British side of the table who took a different view from the government's broader objective for the whole of the United Kingdom, remembering that trade is still a reserved issue.
Sir Edward Lee.
Mum told me that I shouldn't cherry-pick on rules. So when we try and make these free trade agreements, say with America, will the Secretary of State confirm that following the Chequers agreement last week, we will have to accept in its entirety the rule book, the common rule book, and nothing in these free trade deals can deviate in the single respect from the common rule book?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, if that's the agreement that we come to with the European Union, that would be the case. And my honourable friend is right that there would be some restriction in the offers we could make in a free trade agreement. Because of that, it's pointless to state otherwise. But there's still considerable freedom when we look at tariffs, agricultural tariffs, when we look at quotas, for example. Many of the things that those other countries with whom we'll be negotiating want are still entirely within our gift.
Emma Little-Pengelly.
Thank you. Can I welcome the statement by the Secretary of State, and I particularly welcome the commitment in terms of devolved region engagement. But will the Secretary of State commit to fully embed and formalise that engagement with devolved regions within the heart of this policy, including in relation to the negotiating mandate?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope I've set out the broad direction of travel on that today, and we will now be negotiating, discussing, informing the devolved administrations across the United Kingdom to see exactly how we can make that work in practice. I say to her in all candour that I think it's really important that if we are to have trade as a reserved issue for the whole of the United Kingdom, it has to become self-evident that its benefits are actually for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
For the avoidance of any doubt, can the Secretary of State confirm that none of these proposed arrangements would in any way be adversely affected if we leave the EU without a deal and find ourselves operating on WTO terms?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, these arrangements, as I've set out today, have to be standalone. They have to apply whatever the final agreement is that we come to with the European Union. These are about the scrutiny of our future trade agreements. It's without any preconditions attached how we have devised the mechanism itself.
Catherine McKinnon.
Thank you. Appreciating the scope of this question about the future trade agreements, a business from my constituency has said that we already work and export to places like the US, Australia and South Africa, and I fail to see how leaving the single market and the customs union would enhance our ability to do any more of this. Could the Secretary of State please clarify for them how they can contribute to this consultation to ensure that they can actually make something of this new free trade world?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the whole point of free trade agreements is to gain market access where we don't have it today for the benefit of our businesses who want to export. And what I would hope they would do is to set out their level of ambition in each of these trade agreements as they are set out, so that we know, the government understands, just what they think they could do if markets were more open than they are today.
Andrew Murison.
I congratulate my right honourable friend for his statement and ask him what reassurance he is able to offer those who say that the inclusion of agri-food in the Common Rule Book is a sop to farmers in southern Europe and a snub to potential partners in places like North Africa and Latin America.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the comments that I've read most recently is that this would stop Britain being able to import food of a standard that we don't currently find acceptable. I've said here many times at the dispatch box that the government has no interest whatsoever in reducing the quality of the food that we have in the United Kingdom, nor the standards by which it's produced. And in any case, if we were to reduce our standards, that would undermine the reputation of our goods that we sell abroad. It's because of the high standards we have here that, according to Barclays, 57%, for example, of Chinese consumers are willing to pay more for goods made and produced in the UK.
Bentley.
Speaker, the Secretary of State has committed to ensuring that the devolved administrations are able to inform the government's approach to negotiations. But could he clarify what role they will have in the negotiations themselves and whether their consent will be sought before any trade agreement is ratified?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would imagine that in line with other agreements that we would seek legislative consent from the devolved administrations where there were elements where they were required to apply parts of those negotiations. I hope that we are, because I believe that our interests are one and the same, and that we would want to work together to ensure that what we got for UK consumers and UK producers and UK exporters were of maximal benefit.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my experience of public consultations, it's often the case that the people responding are not particularly well informed of the status quo. So will he ensure that as we move forward into this new way of working, that we inform the public of both the situation as it currently is and how it would be improved with the free trade agreements to be signed?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for that question. It's perhaps something I should have included in my statement, because he is entirely right that, again, to go back to the TTIP example, the public didn't feel they were suitably informed. So for each of these potential trade agreements that we bring forward, we will make available to the public a summary of what a free trade agreement actually is and the chapters that it constitutes, and what the specific nature of the country in question is in terms of its market, and what the opportunities will be. The more information we are able to give to all those stakeholders who will want to be part of the consultation, the better the decision collectively we are likely to come to.
Rebecca Parr.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and on that note, really bringing people with us, clearly outlining, explaining and engaging with everybody about what's proposed in the new free trade world is essential, and I really do welcome my right honourable friend's approach to this today. I think it's absolutely the right way to go. And could he confirm that these consultations that have been mentioned will be straightforward for my constituents to actually get involved with in this new free trade world?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have had a look at what other countries have done, particularly with their online content, and how well that has gone down with those who've been involved in consultation processes. And for that reason, I think it's very important that we have an online consultation that is fairly standardised so the public know what is being asked of them, as well as the amount of information that they're being given.
Philip Hollowburn.
Would a comprehensive free trade agreement with the United States be more likely or less likely as a result of the White Paper?
It will be dependent upon what both sides are willing to concede and the level of ambition that both sides have. But following my discussions, not least with the President of the United States last week, I'm very optimistic that such an agreement is well within the reach of both parties.
Stephen Carr.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and also congratulate him on the approach he is taking. When will he be able to set out which countries he's hoping to enter into negotiations with?
I expect to be able to do that within days, Madam Deputy Speaker, rather than many weeks.
And the prize for patience and perseverance goes to Tom Pursgler.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend met last week with the US President. Did he indicate the US's desire to do a free trade deal with the United Kingdom? And if so, how will this consultation help to directly affect and influence that process?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, in line with his patience, may I take the opportunity to thank in this House, my honourable friend, for all the work he did as my PPS. He was one of the best PPSs it's been my pleasure to come across in 26 years in the House of Commons. Yes, the United States did show that they have an appetite for this, and I think that what will be of interest to them is our willingness to be extraordinarily transparent and to give Parliament the scrutiny powers that most other countries take for granted.
Thank you. I now call Pete Wishart to make an application for leave to propose a debate on a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration under the terms of Standing Order number 24. The honourable member has 3 minutes in which to make such an application. Mr Wishart.
And I'm very grateful to you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is my third such attempt to secure a Standing Order 24 debate. So far it's been 0 out of 2, but I'm hoping for better fortune with this application. And I rise, Madam Deputy Speaker, to propose that this House debates a specific and important matter for urgent consideration, namely that the House should debate section 9.5 of the Ministerial Code. Madam Deputy Speaker, the release of the Department for exiting the EU's White Paper last Thursday, the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, was nothing less than a farce. Yeah. Chaotic scenes of members of Parliament throwing white papers across this chamber like frisbees did nothing for the reputation of this House or the reputation of the document itself. At the point when the Secretary of State rose to give his statement, neither our office nor the Labour Whip's office had received a copy of his statement. Madam Deputy Speaker, may I refer to section 9.5 of the Ministerial Code, which states: a copy of the text of an oral statement should usually be given to the opposition shortly before it is made. For that purpose, 15 copies of the statement and associated documents should be sent to the Chief Whip's office at least 45 minutes before the statement is to be made. At the same time, a copy of the final text of an oral statement should in all cases be sent in advance to Mr Speaker. Now, I don't know whether Mr Speaker did in fact receive a copy of the final text, but what I do absolutely know is that that same white paper had been given to members of the press at 9 o'clock this morning, compounding the total disrespect to this House. Madam Deputy Speaker, this was an important statement and an even more important document. This House has been waiting 2 years for some kind of negotiating position from Her Majesty's Government. The EU has equally been waiting for those 2 years, and people from right across these aisles have been waiting to hear what this Government was going to propose. As you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, Scotland did not vote for this Brexit. We did not endorse it, and we want nothing whatsoever there to do with it. And here we have the shambling crises occurring right across Whitehall, crises that seem to be developing by the hour. But can I take this opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to thank Mr Speaker for adjourning this chaotic session to ensure that members had at least a few minutes to skim some of the pages of this document before attempting to hold the Secretary of State to account. What the public must have made of these proceedings is anyone's guess, and it's not the first time that the Department of Leaving the European Union have done this. One instance of this may be an accident, but we are starting to see a troubling trend from the Department on exiting the EU and others. This is just about the worst possible example of a breach of the Ministerial Code, and in this matter requires more attention from this House, and I humbly request an emergency debate to get the answers that this House and this country need.
The honourable member has asked leave to propose a debate on what is known as a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration, namely section 9.5 of the Ministerial Code. I have listened carefully to the application from the honourable member, made in his usual excellent rhetorical manner, and I have to tell him that I'm not persuaded that this matter is proper to be discussed under Standing Order number 24. I thank the honourable gentleman for his usual excellent and entertaining rhetoric.